get this feed going here. Well, again, everybody, welcome. And again, I apologize for the technical delay there for a second. Again, I want to welcome my good friend, Andrew Parish from Dublin, Ireland. He is in a beautiful spot in the city, if you've ever been there, right on St. Stephen's Green. And of course, I've got my Irish flag. And I even have, I don't know if you can tell, but I have a shirt full of shamrocks.
Good for you. Andrew.
So tell if you could just start off and give a little background to our audience, the brief bio of Andrew Parish.
Yeah, well, I'm delighted to be here, John, but still confused as to why you would want to have a conversation with me, given I have no particular specialty in any direction, and I'm classically the jack of all trades. I mean, I started my career in a technical role as a chemist, and moved into sales and technical sales and sales management, and ended up in startups, either leading startups, investing in startups, mentoring startups, closing down startups. So I've been through the gambit of early stage ventures on a number of different angles, and now find myself happily employed here on Stephen's Green in an investment fund that's providing capital to growing enterprises here in Ireland, and delighted to have the opportunity to chat with you today, if we can.
Yeah, very good. And we've known each other a long time. I think it goes back about 10 years, something like that. And I don't even remember who exactly introduced us.
So it actually came through the American Embassy here in Dublin. So at the time I was running a renewable energy technology company that would have been, I suppose, the embassy would have been aware of us because we had opened an operation in the US. So we had an office in Annapolis, Maryland. We were a marine energy company, so being close to the US Navy Academy made sense to us, and being close to DC. And at the time, Jan, I think this was maybe your first trip to Ireland with your MBA class, and the embassy had been co-opted to try and find willing donors or willing recipients of your students. And of course, I was happy to have them, and was very glad that we did. They did some great work with us.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that company, Wave Bob, here in a little bit. I've got just some general questions. The title of our talk today is Leading in New Ventures, and oftentimes people think, well, that means being an entrepreneur. But new venture can be as part of a large organization. It could be your own gig. It could be even a nonprofit or a government entity. I mean, when you think of a new venture, I mean, what are all the ways that you've seen of, variances of new ventures out there?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, classically people think of a new venture as, a startup founder sitting in their bedroom, kind of with their laptop writing lines of code, or trying to come up with a way to raise their first seed round of investment. I mean, I spent a number of years working in consultancy, helping small companies to grow their business. So very often, it was helping them to come up with an innovative idea that then they could put resources behind to take forward. So that new product line or that new opportunity was a new venture within an existing organization that may be very mature. And in some respects, looking back, they were some of the most exciting things I was involved with, where you go to a very traditional, stable organization and you kind of bring in a spark of, an innovation kind of creativity process that just gets them to think about what's the one thing they could develop or achieve that would leapfrog the competition. And all of a sudden you see lights go on in the management's eyes when they realize they've been, competing maybe on commodity or price for years, and now all of a sudden they have the opportunity to compete on something that's very innovative. And that was a new venture, and it's great to see that kind of awakening in mature companies. But I guess, my experience over the last kind of 15 years has been more about the more traditional early stage companies, with an entrepreneur that sees an opportunity, or more truthfully, probably sees a problem that's annoying them. And it's annoying them because nobody's actually fixed it. And it's annoyed them so much that if nobody else is going to fix it, well, then I should probably do it myself. And it's that kind of starting point that I suppose would more traditionally define a new venture.
Yeah. One thing that we do with the students when they come to Ireland, we always ask them to not only learn about new ventures, but to really compare and contrast the difference culturally between the United States and Ireland. And And what's always interesting is the Irish know a lot more about the United States than vice versa. But one of the observations the students always make is how humble, the Irish are. That they're not real good self-promoters, not real good marketers. And I know, your first remark of our conversation today was, the same thing. What is it, that you think is a big difference in the way that leaders lead in Ireland, and the way, and again, you've worked in the United States, and you've seen it. What do you think the big differences are?
I think I think the humility is a national pastime. I think as a race we tend to be kind of self-deprecating and kind of confused as to how anybody would have any interest in Ireland outside of the Irish, and yet we're always surprised when the world celebrates St. Patrick's Day along with the rest of us. So that kind of humility, I think, is kind of hardwired into most Irish people. I think if I was to look at leadership styles, I think what I've experienced is leadership in Ireland is much more about people. In the States, it's much more transactional. So it's about getting the deal done, closing the contract, making the sale. Here, it's about actually, do I want to build a relationship with somebody before I do business with them? So I think this, Irish people like to make connections. And Jan, this from coming to Ireland often enough, that as soon as you introduce yourself, you'll say, well, are you the Rutherford that's married to and connected to and a first cousin of? So it's a natural thing in Ireland that we like to know who we're talking to by finding out how we're connected. So that natural curiosity ultimately leads to positive relationships, because if I'm curious, I'll ask you questions and I'll be interested enough to hear the answer, and you build up that trust and that connection. And I think business is a bit easier when that trust and connectivity exists.
Yeah, and over the last 4 months, how has that changed? I mean, are we, in Ireland, it's coffee shops and pubs where these connections are made. In the absence of that, is it still possible to create these deep and meaningful relationships remotely from a distance?
Well, as a proud Irishman, I'd say you can never build a decent relationship without a pint of Guinness in front of you. So it's become hard over the last 4 months, and less informal. So I think what's happened certainly over the last while, it's forced obviously all of us to be a little bit more proactive and a bit more conscious about our relationships. Things happen by serendipity here. As you say, you meet somebody over a beer and all of a sudden, you've been introduced to their friend, and all of a sudden there's a new business opportunity. Now, over the last 4 months, you need to be more conscious. You need to actually make time to get in front of somebody, have a conversation, even just 2 minutes, with your team to say, how's it going? Good morning. Later on. So you miss that opportunity for the kind of the coffee counter or the water cooler moments. So you have to make them happen. At the same time, I've found it's easier to get talking to people on a Zoom call because they're all stuck at home. So I've had more productive meetings, and my workday has become a lot more efficient because you can kind of book meetings in half-hour slots. And it's so in some respects it's forced us to be a little bit more sterile, but actually it's been very efficient.
Yeah, I would agree. We got some comments coming in. One from Lynn Harris: Ireland's the most memorable and satisfying country I've been to. It's the people in combination of the land. And somebody, a gentleman that's coming on our crucible out in the Rocky Mountains in a couple of weeks, Wayne Wetton, asked, your definition of this relationship building, asked, would you call that servant leadership?
Yeah, I guess that could be a definition of it. I think, there is a natural. I mean, a good example of the difference, I think, maybe between what we see here and what I've seen in the States is this kind of sense of being brash. Like, that's something like Irish people, if you're seen to be brash, you'll have the rest of the population cut the legs out from underneath you. So we tend to be a little bit cautious. And I remember pitching to a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. Kind of the classic, standing in the partner's room with the clock at the back of the room ticking down from 20 minutes. And before I went into pitch, and we had a really good business plan, a good pitch, one of the partners who was friendly and happened to have Irish roots, so was keen to help out, he said to me, Andrew, he said, you've got to just put an extra zero behind all of your numbers on the business plan. But that's not credible. And he said, you have to remember that people coming in here to pitch, the normal sort of US entrepreneurs will automatically inflate all of their numbers to put their best foot forward. And he said, as a consequence, the VCs will discount most of the business plans by 50%. He said, the Irish guys come in here and you're giving an honest projection that is a lot more modest, but then when it's discounted by 50%, it doesn't look interesting at all. So maybe that was just a kind of a real crystal example to me of sometimes we kind of undersell ourselves a little.
Yeah, that's been my perspective. It is the same thing. A lot of precision, a lot of really good on the quantitative. A little bit less brash, as you would say, on the marketing and the self-promotion and sales. And the interesting thing of the podcast that we've done, over 200 episodes now, we've had great people on the show. We've also had some people that are really well known, and when you start to talk to them, you think, boy, there's a lot of marketing here, and not a lot of substance. And it's just interesting because you wonder, boy, that's not how it should work. I mean, it should always be the content, the substance over style.
And John, I mean, you've been talking about authentic leadership for years. I mean, your book, was about being authentic, and I think that's something certainly that I would have learned from you is not to apologize for who or what you are or what you believe in, but actually to believe in yourself and be honest with yourself and those that you work with and those that follow you.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you again. One of the things that I've observed in Ireland, and maybe it's an old thing and not so much anymore, but there was a time when, gosh, the last thing I want to do is go be an entrepreneur, because if I fail, I've got a black mark on my record, and I can't go forward. And so people were not willing to take risks. And so a lot of the people that we had get in front of the students would talk about all their success stories. I touched this and it turned to gold, and I touched this and it turned to gold. You were one of the few people that got up and really said, hey, we had a really good run. It did not go as planned. And you were very honest about, the setbacks and your own shortcomings. Is that something that's changed in Ireland, that people are more willing to take risks than they were before? Is it maybe something that they've learned from America? I mean, what's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, probably. I think the longer answer would be we've had to embrace risk more by virtue of the fact that we went through this absolutely horrific financial crash, 2008, 2012, like the rest of the world did. But in Ireland, it hit really, really deep and hard because we'd had this Celtic tiger phenomenon where we all lost the run of ourselves. We were heading off to Las Vegas for weekend parties, and this was just not something that was in the Irish kind of psyche. So we had become, as a nation, very rich very quickly, and then we had a really deep crash, and that, I suppose, ended up with what I call distressed entrepreneurs, people that probably had a very good job or had made money through property that had lost it all, lost the job, lost their security, and by necessity had to get up and start a company. Jan, your ancestors left Ireland probably because of famine or poverty, as most Irish American families would recognize. But in the last financial crash, the fact that there was a global recession, we didn't have that outlet where people could just head to the States or the UK or Australia to the same degree. So there was a sense of, gee, I need to find a job, and if I can't find a job, I need to make one myself. So I think there was an acceptance that being an entrepreneur was a more, for want of a better phrase, valid option, a valid career option. Secondly, I think people recognize that failure happens. You can be a very successful property developer or a very successful business owner, and then stuff happens. Some of it may be within your control and some of it outside of your control, and businesses fail. And it's not for want of trying, or it's not by any malice on the part of the business leaders, but it happens. And I think all of us in Ireland now would recognize and would know somebody that has had a business failure over the last 10 or 15 years. So that kind of understanding of failures and companies failing has probably grown, and therefore we're more accepting and closer to the kind of the US model, which is almost to have a failed enterprise behind you as a badge of honor. And there is certainly a recognition now that if you have been through, actually, to change the phrasing of it, like most investors would say, the worst person to reinvest in is somebody that's had one success. The worst business mentor is somebody who's had one success, because they assume that every decision they made was the right one, because ultimately they exited their company and they're driving a Porsche. People who have, as I have, been in a business that ultimately failed, you second guess and you revisit every single decision you made to say, well, what if I'd made that decision differently? Would the outcome have been different? So I think you become a lot more self-aware and much more self-critical when you've been through a business that ultimately fails, than somebody who has sailed through and thinks that they have the Midas touch.
So let me ask you, the penultimate question maybe is, what leadership experience have you had that taught you the most, and why?
So without doubt, it was leading a company that was, to use your phrase, was a crucible. Like we were developing a marine energy technology, which is very expensive to develop. I used to despair at how software companies could pivot, and all it would cost them was a few extra pizzas and a few beers for the developers over a weekend. For us to change our technology was another iteration, which could have cost €1 million or €1.5 million of a prototype. So we had very high capital requirements, very engineering heavy technology in a world that all of a sudden collapsed financially. So we raised, between grants and investment, we raised about $15 million for that venture, and went looking for more, and it wasn't there. And ultimately, at the same time, the price of oil fell. So investment in alternative energy was put back. So we just ended up in this perfect storm of circumstances that were outside of our control, but we made a whole ton of mistakes internally as well. But having to manage a team of exceptionally bright PhD engineers and physicists, trying to lead them through a time where you're struggling for cash flow, you're worried whether you're going to make payroll at the end of the month, having to let people go on a temporary basis while you raise capital to bring it back in, that teaches you authentic leadership, because you put yourself in a situation that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy, and you have to work your way through it, and you have to trust your instincts, and you have to trust the management team that are around you.
Yeah. When you reflect back on that, I mean, if you had to say, hey, the thing that I did really well as a CEO was this, and the thing that if I did it all over again, I would have made sure I didn't do this. What would those two things be?
Yeah, I think certainly the thing I was and still am most proud of is the team that we built. So we had an exceptional team of bright, articulate, passionate, opinionated people. Sometimes the challenge was managing all those opinions when you're trying to move a company forward. And at the time, it sounds horrible when people lose their jobs and the company folds. But if I look back at where all these people are that used to work for me, they've all gone on to much better and greater things. So that's so building the team was certainly the most enjoyable, and I think I did that reasonably well. The thing that I probably didn't do enough of was manage. And I think we had a challenge where my job, because of the nature of the work that we're in and the time, my job was very much outside of the company, trying to raise capital, trying to bring in investment to keep the lights on. We also had a challenging dynamic on our board, so a lot of time was spent kind of at boardroom issues. So I probably wasn't in the company as much as I could have or should have been, but spent a lot of time trying to raise the capital and kind of act as the shield between the board and the staff in order to keep things moving along.
Yeah. There's a question that came in. I'm putting it up on the screen right now. You somewhat covered it with the extra zero on your numbers, so account for local expectations. But in relation to moving from a home market to international for growing a business, are there any lessons you can share? For example, do you try to manage the business from your home base, or do you engage a locally based talent?
That's a perfect question from somebody who's involved in localization. So if anybody knows kind of how to adapt yourself for a particular market, it's Stephen. So in my case, certainly, and I've seen this with other companies I've been involved in, it's very difficult to land somebody in a different market and expect them to hit the ground running, build a network, build trust. What we did in WaveBob's case, where we opened an office in Annapolis, was the decision to open a premises there was preceded by having the right person. And Derek happened to be somebody that I had worked with before, was a good friend of mine, had moved back to the States from working here in Ireland. So there was trust there to begin with. So I knew that he was a capable, solid manager that could start and build his own network there. So in effect, it was a satellite office. So the core functions happened back in Ireland, but in his case, he drew on the work that we were doing here and then amplified it locally. I think it would have been incredibly difficult and incredibly expensive for us to land in Irish managers into a US company and then try and expect them to have the same kind of connectivity and success that he had. I see that now with some of the startups where they are looking to open an office in the States and they're planning to send one or two of their senior team over. I think that's very difficult unless you've raised capital in the States or Australia or wherever your market is. Because if you've raised capital in the new market, shall we say, you've got vested interest of investors who are motivated to make sure you're connected, to make sure you can hit the ground running. So you've got a friendly door to give you the shelter when you need it. But I think other than having investors or trusted people there already, I think it's very difficult to just manage from sending a team off to boldly go where no one has gone before.
Well, and I appreciate that. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to try to combine a few questions. We've gotten some questions about, is it helpful knowing the cultural backgrounds? I think you've addressed that to a degree. Somebody's asking, how do we remain relevant in business and professional life? How do we get ahead when, by inflating or accentuating the positive and being the only honest person in the room? And, and then, from a networking perspective, having really great mentors. I think there's a theme in all that, in that it's somebody's really trying to say, hey, I really want to be value centered, in my personal life and my professional life and those I associate with. Any thoughts there and how it might turn into advice or mentorship you've received?
So, I mean, I've been fortunate that I've had really good mentors, and I still do, and value them greatly. And then I also am a mentor myself. So I would work with a number of CEOs just on a friendly basis. And then I work as a mentor for Enterprise Ireland. And Enterprise Ireland is the state agency for supporting high growth companies. So I've kind of seen it from both sides. And I think probably, one of the most valuable business pieces of advice I was ever given was my sales training manager back in 1993, who was a big Yorkshire man from the north of England. And he said to me, Parish, remember, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that ratio. And it's true. As a leader, as a manager, as a mentor, you need to listen twice as much as you're talking. If you're talking, you're not actually communicating and hearing what's going on. So I think, if I was to think of what should leaders do more of, it's probably listen. It's listen to staff, listen to customers, listen to their advisors, their mentors, take counsel. I mean, some of the most successful entrepreneurs I have seen are super impressive people that actually are quite happy to say, I don't know all of this. I don't have all the answers. I need to hear this from somebody else. And in some cases, they may have the answers themselves, but they just want to bounce it past somebody and get a validation. So I think, I know all of the business books will always say leaders should take time just to clear the decks and spend some time thinking for themselves. I actually think you should clear the decks and listen more, listen to what's going on around you.
Yeah, that's good counsel. What is it that you think, the biggest challenge facing leaders today? And again, that might be different today than it was 4 months ago, but today, what do you think is the biggest challenge?
Well, I think today and for the foreseeable, like managing remote teams is a skill that leaders and managers are going to have to develop. We have all been forced to work from a home environment or from a socially distanced environment. So that imposes certain challenges. I mean, it's hard enough managing a remote team when there's a core of you in an office together. When everyone is scattered, I think, trying to, particularly as a leader of a new venture or an early stage venture, one of the key responsibilities you have as the leader of that organization is to set the tone, to create the culture, to make sure the values that you espouse as an organization are actually lived every day. So for example, we had a set of values in one of our companies, but we also had a which means that. If we say we're innovative, this means we will do these things. It also means we won't do these things. Like we won't say, oh, that can't be done. The first thing should be, how can we figure it out? So I think, setting culture, living the values, leading by example are all very difficult when you're communicating in two dimensions like we are now. I mean, Jan, in particular, like in Ireland, we like to talk. We like to engage with people, go for a cup of coffee, go for lunch, have a pint after work. And it's easy to kind of build those relationships in that kind of environment. When you're working from home and you're trying to balance, family, the dog, the postman ringing the doorbell just as you're about to join a board meeting, all of those kind of things, it's a different discipline. And I think, if anything, I think it's been really refreshing to see how people cope with the fact that people can actually be very productive working from home with a dog on their lap and kids running in the background. It actually doesn't matter anymore. So I think what I started by saying is a challenge for managers. It is. But I actually think enlightened managers should recognize that what's happened over the last 3 or 4 months has fundamentally changed the way that we manage and the way that we see employees as somebody who needs to be managed, and instead provide the creativity and the flexibility to allow them to work within whatever space and time that works for them, but to set the performance metrics and the expectations of them in a clear fashion, so there isn't that kind of loss of productivity or sense that people aren't aligned with the mission of the organization.
Yeah, you made an interest at the very beginning of your comments. You said setting the tone, and part of that is being very intentional. We've often said, is your culture by design or is it by default? And so I think, what I'm hearing you say is, if you just let things be, I mean, it will be a culture, but it will be one by default. That to set the tone, to set the pace, to set the parameters, the standards, whatever those are. Again, what I'm hearing you say, almost from a servant leadership perspective, is you really need to be compassionate. You really need to listen. And this is a comment I just came in from David McNamee in Nashville, North Carolina. Asked about servant leadership and your thoughts there. Is that resonating?
I think it is, and I think when I talk about, like, everyone that's ever written a business plan or studied in business school, you'll be taught to do your SWOT analysis, do your mission objectives, tactics, all of that, set the vision and the values for the organization. But we kind of do that whilst we're thinking about the shopping list, we're typing it up and sending it out. The values of the company will be whatever looks good on a marketing slide deck. But actually, I think it's particularly important for early stage ventures that those values are actually fundamental tenets of your organization. And those values should be the touchstone. So when you're hiring somebody, if they don't meet the values that you're trying to build into your organization, don't hire them, even if they're technically brilliant, if they don't meet the touchstone that you've set. And for me, it was always about answering that question, which means that we want to respect our staff. Okay, that's a value that a lot of companies have. But what does that mean? Actually, what does that translate into in terms of HR policies, in terms of family-friendly policies? So I think a lot of strategists stop short. They put the values up there and say, great, now we've got our vision, mission, and values, and we've passed that test. But actually, they don't actively make sure that that's built into the company. And in a positive and a negative sense, and by a negative sense, I mean you actually call out somebody if they don't live by those values, and it becomes part of your management structure and how you measure and reward people.
Yeah, I really like those 3 words, which means that, because often organizations will be very adamant about putting their values up on the wall or on their website, but they haven't really defined what the behaviors are that make up those values. They could say integrity. It's like, well, what's integrity mean in the way that you behave and conduct yourself, and are there consequences when you don't behave that way, good or bad? One of the things you mentioned, crucible, which is a severe test in which people hopefully come out stronger because of a adversity or difficulty. I'm wondering, what do you think in these times makes people rise to tough challenges in this whole thing? I mean, we're in an ultra marathon, we're not in a sprint. Right now, what do you think it takes for leaders to get people to rise up and meet these things head on with sort of a gusto?
I think, I mentioned earlier, what a lot of entrepreneurs start by doing is seeing a problem they need to fix. And I think leadership emerges when they see it being done wrong. Inevitably, people, in any walk of life, in any function, you'll always compare yourself to something and say, could I do a better job than that? Or, somebody's singing a song in the pub, can I sing as well as them? Can I play the guitar as good as Stephen Harris, who, kind of was on earlier? So I think there's an inevitable comparison. And I think when you see bad leadership, you see bad decisions being made, you see shortcuts being taken in companies, I think that's a problem that should be solved. If I was a technical person, I'd solve a technical problem by writing lines of code. If I'm a manager or a leader and I see it being done wrong, I think there's a requirement for us, and the adrenaline goes to step up and say, actually, I can do a better job than that. So I think the answer to your question is, I think recognition of the problem and a bit of confidence to say, well, at least I can do better than that. I may not be the best, but I can do better than that.
Yeah. So shifting gears a little bit, tell us about what you're working on now, and in particular, how it might relate to American businesses.
Yeah, so I've kind of gone from being self-employed, doing a whole bunch of different things, and ended up finding a home for myself with an organization which is called taxback.com. So it's a financial services organization with about 10 different businesses within the group, all of which associated with international transactions. And I'm in one of those businesses with a small investment fund that is actually starting to become quite a large investment fund, but is focused on we sort of describe it as a social capital fund. So we're raising investment in order to put it work into the Irish economy, to support Irish businesses, to do that at more competitive and more innovative ways than the commercial banks and the alternative lenders are doing. So we're kind of bringing good quality capital to help Irish companies to scale. We happen to be an approved investment fund under an Irish government program called the Immigrant Investor Program. And this is a scheme in the US, it's kind of like the EB5 scheme, where if somebody invests in Ireland at least €1 million, then they can qualify for permanent residency status in Ireland. So we've had a lot of interest and a number of investors from the US, from South Africa, from Hong Kong at the moment, where people see Ireland as a great opportunity for themselves, either from a business perspective, because the economy prior to COVID, and I'm sure after COVID, will continue to grow. So it's a good place to invest. We have a great track record of foreign direct investment with all the tech companies that are here, as you'll know, but also people recognizing it for their children, from an educational perspective, access to Europe, all of those things. So I kind of find myself now working for a larger organization in a very entrepreneurial fashion. So we started off with 0 in the fund. We're now heading to 100 million, and we're about to start the second fund. So for me, it's a nice home of having a kind of a framework around us where we've got group IT and HR and finance and all that, but a really small core team of passionate, creative people that are kind of hustling to start this as a new venture. And glad to say, knock on wood, we've had some success over the last year.
Yeah, and what excites you about the future? I mean, we've gotten some other comments that say, do you think this, post-COVID, we're going to continue working remotely? I mean, there's all kinds of implications. We're all trying to figure out what this all means. What I've seen with all the people that I work with and get to interact with is, which really great and refreshing, is positivity. I just don't see the cynicism. I mean, there's things that are difficult. And, there's problems here in the US, there's problems in the world, but generally the business people that I am interacting with are looking for the opportunities. And again, the opportunities doesn't mean something to be exploited for the sake of money. The opportunities means, like what you said, there's problems. And there's, if you're a first mover, you're going to be able to, get in there and solve those problems sooner than other people. What is it that you're, again, being a little bit of a put on your prognosticator hat, what do you see out a year or 2, 3 in the future?
So I think the world has been, and still is in some areas, has been through a crucible, as you've described. And the reason that you take a bunch of guys off into the wilderness for a week, Jan, is that they come out stronger and with a greater sense of confidence in their own abilities. I think all of us, going through this COVID crisis, will come out stronger and recognize, actually, it's not the end of the world. Yes, things are very different, but we will emerge and we will continue. So I think that's kind of just a reaffirmation that life goes on. Maybe different, but life goes on. I'm really excited about the fact that work-life balance is going to be different. So I'm in our office today. This is the first time I've been in the office since middle of March. And it feels actually quite strange to be in here. It feels really strange to be wearing a shirt and trousers again instead of a t-shirt and shorts. So, so I think the ability to be more flexible in the workforce, I think, is going to be something that will last. Even in this organization here, we're now saying, well, actually, we have a lovely building here on Stephen's Green in Dublin, but actually, we may not need all this space. Before we were bursting at the seams, but now it's going to become a lot more flexible, where people can work from home, come in for 2 days a week, come in for meetings, and then go home again. So I think it's kind of broken that management expectation that you shall be at your desk at 8:30 in the morning and you will be there until you leave at 6 o'clock and you will be fully productive for all the time that you're there. Yeah. That's gone, and that excites me, because that kind of flexible working, whether you're working from home or in a Starbucks on your laptop, that kind of working is entrepreneurial working. So I'm excited about the fact that we've kind of broken the shackles of the office desk, and people will inevitably become a bit more creative, and actually, I fundamentally believe, more productive when you can work from anywhere. And technology now enables us to do that. Zoom, we can have meetings all day long, as often as we want. There are a whole bunch of tools that enable people to work creatively and effectively together. A friend of Stephen of mine has a marketing company. All of his staff are working remotely. Sorry, Jan, you know him, Kieran. He was on the Crucible with you. So Kieran's staff are by nature creative. They collaborate to come up with great new ideas and new brands. They're all working remotely. And Kieran has no expectation that he'll be back in the office anytime soon. So to me, that's hugely empowering, that we've now allowed people and we've given them the reassurance and the confidence to say, go and work. You know what to do. Touch base regularly so we don't lose touch. But that's an entrepreneurial way of working in the future.
Yeah, and I think, a big problem in business for a long time has been the whole idea of trust. It's been built, the idea of a team is built on a very weak foundation of trust. And now we haven't had a choice but to trust people. And we're finding, I think, that we can. And I think that's been, again, the research I'm seeing is most people would love a combination of working remotely and coming in the office. I don't think most people want to work in the office 8 to 5, 5 days a week anymore. And, even if somebody's in their bunny slippers at home, doesn't mean they're not being productive. Yeah. So I think that's interesting. 2 more questions and we'll wrap here. My good friend, David Ortiz from Denver, who's a young veteran, military veteran, who's running for office in Littleton, Colorado. Go David. Is asking about, what is it that, local political leaders can do that's going to really help with the economic recovery and to help business leaders? And I think that's a great question, because in my opinion, there aren't enough politicians out there that really have a sense of, small to mid-sized business needs and what, how important that is for our economic engine. So any advice to somebody I know is going to win his race?
So I'm coming back to it. There's a theme emerging here, which is listen. I think It's important to hear what's happening at ground level, not to listen to the lobbyists or the industry associations who will always represent their biggest donors, but actually to listen to a business owner to say, here are the practical challenges, like, politicians don't create jobs. We all know that. The job of government is to create the framework and then get out of the way. That's the cliche that everyone talks about. The reality is that there are certain practical things that do need to be put in place now to help businesses recover from this. Fortunately, in Ireland, the government have been pretty business friendly and have put the right structures in place. Having said that, it looks great. We have all these schemes that help small businesses. Actually, the amount of money that's been paid out to help those businesses has been tiny because of the bureaucracy and the red tape and the application process. So if you're going to do something to help businesses, do it. Don't talk about it. Don't wrap it up in public sector view of the world. Go and talk to the business owners to say how, like, every business owner I know recognizes that the public sector have certain requirements and responsibilities because they're spending taxpayers' money. So there has to be governance and a particular level of administration. But it doesn't have to be the gold standard of bureaucracy. Just make it business friendly. And the way you make it business friendly, listen to what business owners need.
Yeah, great counsel. And lastly, Andrew, well, first I want to just thank you for agreeing to come on. Selfishly, it's great because I get to spend some time with you, my good dear friend. Picture you're at a lecture hall at Trinity College, and there's 100 people in the room, and they're all high potential leaders and emerging leaders, and they're people that are going to take on a new venture, whether it be their own venture or within another organization. And you got the opportunity to give them your best piece of advice. What would that be?
Go get a job in PwC. So no, I'm joking. No, so actually, it's funny when you describe that scene, it just reminds me of a particular example. So back when we first met, Jan, that marine energy company I was running, I was invited to give a talk in Stanford. So I'm standing in the lecture theatre in the engineering school in Stanford. And at the end of it, a bunch of students came up and asked questions. And one of them asked some really smart, clever questions about what we were doing. And I assumed he was an engineering student. When I asked him what branch of engineering was he studying, he said, I'm not. I'm studying medicine. He's gone on now to become a psychiatrist. And his particular research interest is entrepreneurial psychiatry. And he's based in San Francisco. So I suppose what I took from him, from Ryan Louie, I don't know if he's on LinkedIn, but what I took from that was, don't be obvious, be curious. So here was a medical student that came to a boring talk from an Irish guy talking about wave energy devices, like the farthest thing away from what a medical student should or ought to be spending their time doing. So for me, that just taught me, be curious. That opens up a world of opportunities. I've probably actually said this to somebody today. I've probably said yes more than I have said no to many things, which usually puts a kind of a challenge on timing. But I find my unique skill is probably able to juggle a lot of things all at once. But I have to say, I think be confident in your abilities, find good people to work with, and my 3 golden rules. Can I give them, Jan?
Absolutely.
Do interesting work, because life's too short to be in a boring job. Get paid for that work, because it's really easy to do interesting work for voluntary or mentoring or advising startups that can't pay. So make sure you get some money to cover the bills and keep the family happy. And the 3rd rule, and forgive me for using the vernacular, don't work with assholes. And I have turned down working in really interesting, well-paid positions because I just couldn't cope with the people or the person that I'd be working with. And for me, that would be my advice. Find some interesting work with good people, and the rest will come from that.
Yeah, great counsel, and great being with you again, Andrew. And anything we can do from across the pond to support you and your efforts, always open to helping, because you would never violate that 3rd rule.
Thanks, Jan. You're very kind, and likewise, that's why we're talking. So I have to say, it's great to chat, and we miss you having you here in Ireland, Jan. It's always a treat seeing you and Jackie and some of your students coming over every year. So we miss that. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, well, hopefully in the next year we'll be able to come back, and I'll just leave up one other thing and just a little bit of a tiny little commercial. We've got a bunch of great courses out on LinkedIn Learning that all sort of revolve around the topic we discussed today. So if you're out there, just head over to LinkedIn Learning. You can look up my name, but there's not just my course, but there's just tons of great courses. Anything you want to learn, it's out there these days. And as Andrew said, it's all about being curious. So with that, we'll sign off here, everybody. Again, thank you for your comments and participating. And please feel free to share this with your friends, because it will be recorded and we'll get it posted. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone. Take care.